mid-40s. Brian Pillman's coronary at just 35 was attributed to drug abuse. David Sheldon collapsed and died at 43 of unknown causes. The junkyard dog had a well-known drug problem and was killed in a car crash. And then there's Davy Boy Smith, the Dynamite Kid's partner, dead of a heart attack at 39. Steroid abuse was identified as a likely factor. As for the Dynamite Kid, he'd become a mere shadow of his former self, no longer able to wrestle, reduced to watching his old matches all day on television.
When that wrestling ability diminished, so too did his self-esteem, his self-worth. I remember him watching especially the Japanese tapes, his Tiger Mask matches, just over and over. It was just an obsession with him, and just regretting that he couldn't do that anymore. It was quite sad, actually.
Weighing 249 pounds, Chris Benoit!
Though Chris Benoit was still on top of the wrestling world, by 2005 his path seemed eerily like that of his former idol. He'd reconciled with his wife, but Benoit's father says his son suffered severe depression, fueled by steroids, taking painkillers after a broken neck, with frequent bouts of paranoia.
Chris was totally paranoid. They said that the chauffeur that actually used to drive him home from the airport at times said, Chris would tell him, take a different route. I don't want people to follow me home. They had their son in a lockdown school so that no one would kidnap him. They moved into this new house with large fencing all around. Went out and got 2 trained German shepherds to protect the house because, people were after them.
By the end of 2005, Benoit had attended the funerals of over a dozen former wrestling colleagues. But there was one from which he wouldn't recover. His best friend in wrestling was Eddie Guerrero. In November that year, Guerrero collapsed and died of heart disease after a history of substance abuse. He was only 38. For Chris Benoit, it was more than he could take.
And all of a sudden, Chris starts quoting scripture, which is so unlike him. And how did I find out about that? By reading his diary back in 2005.
That diary begins just days after Guerrero's funeral, weaving biblical passages with dark thoughts written directly to his dead friend.
I think we can see that the Eddie Guerrero death was really the beginning where he started to lose touch with reality. He was writing letters to Guerrero from the beyond. Some of it has tinges of Christianity, anxiety and depression are seen in his own writings.
The diary also contains repeated references to his wife and son. But where Benoit seems in despair addressing Guerrero, he writes lovingly about Nancy, whom he calls his best friend, and about little Daniel, the boy who was the light of his life.
What do you believe might have been the role of Daniel in this?
Chris loved Daniel. He didn't love him, he adored him. Absolutely adored him. Chris would be on the road, he'd be dragging his rear end, he'd be, you'd talk to him, he'd seem down, depressed, and it just, and you'd say, boy, this life, is sure taking it out of him. I don't know why he doesn't get out. And you'd say, how's Daniel doing? And his whole demeanor would change. I mean, it would just light up, because he just loved that kid so much.
For Mike Benoit, it would make what happened next even more incomprehensible. On June 25, 2007, police in a suburb of Atlanta were called to the Benoit house. Inside, they found Nancy Benoit and 7-year-old Daniel, strangled in their beds. Chris Benoit was hanging in his home gym, suspended from the neck by the steel cables he used for his workouts.
My world was extremely black. Our family, it was unbelievable, it was horrific, I can't tell you how bad it was.
If the untimely deaths of so many other wrestlers hadn't grabbed public attention, this one would.
Police say Benoit murdered his wife and son on the weekend, then killed himself.
It struck me as somewhat bizarre that perhaps he would even be in the home with their deceased bodies for some length of time.
To those who knew him best, it was an agonizing mystery, even with his wife's accusations of domestic violence.
I mean, that was very plausible, but his son, something was very wrong.
And friends like Jake Roberts also believed there had to be more to the story.
Well, and when I go to heaven or hell, wherever I go, and if God looks at me and I say, God, devil, did he do these horrible things that the public and the press or whoever has said, he did that? You know what I'm going to tell them? Screw you, you're a liar. I don't believe that. Not the man I knew.
And Jake the Snake may well be onto something, as we'll show you after the break, when doctors begin to unlock the secret hidden inside Chris Benoit's brain.
Last night on Monday Night Raw, the WWE presented a special tribute show, recognizing the career of Chris Benoit. However, now some 26 hours later, the facts of this horrific tragedy are now apparent.
The day after the discovery of Benoit's home in Atlanta, World Wrestling boss Vince McMahon began to distance himself from his former champion. The police now knew it had been a double murder and a suicide that unfolded over 3 days. Benoit killed his wife, then his child, placed Bibles next to their bodies, then stayed in the house before hanging himself.
Therefore, other than my comments, there will be no mention of Mr. Benoit's name tonight.
On the World Wrestling website, Benoit highlights were erased. Merchandise with his name removed from sale.
Did anabolic steroids play a role in the deaths of Benoit and his family?
Speculation about what happened and why was rampant.
A few years ago, she filed a domestic violence complaint against Benoit. Also, anabolic steroids are found in the house.
The public consensus seemed overwhelming. It was the steroids.
Even Congress, believe it or not, is poised to act to bring down the hammer on steroid use within pro wrestling.
Chris Benoit's physician was arrested for improper prescriptions. He'd reportedly been giving Benoit almost a year's supply of steroids every month.
No comment.
The loss of his daughter-in-law and grandson at the hands of his only child was more than Mike Benoit or any parent could bear.
I wish he would have died of a heart attack or a car crash or anything. It would have been much easier to handle than what we were given.
At the time, like almost everyone else, he believed it could well have been the steroids. But some who knew the wrestling world from the inside weren't so sure, like Chris Benoit's old friend, Bret Hart.
Well, personally, I've seen wrestlers that were, a lot of wrestlers that were on steroids and had short fuses and stuff, but the kind of temper and rage that would come out, they were the kind of guys that go out and tip your car over in the parking lot, but they wouldn't actually fight you or do anything to you physically. Or it was, I don't think steroids made you lose your sense of right and wrong.
The week after the murders, full of anguish and doubt, was the longest of Mike Benoit's life. Then, for what must have seemed like the millionth time, the phone rang. Someone else offering condolences. The caller introduced himself as Chris Nowinski. He said he was a former wrestler, and he had a question about Mike's son.
I was actually spent the first 2 days trying to get somebody who already knew to go between to make the introduction, because I didn't think he would answer the phone.
Nowinski was apprehensive because what he wanted to ask was, could he have Chris Benoit's brain?
And I kept looking at the phone thinking, is this the National Enquirer? Like, who is this?
Chris Nowinski wrestled under the name Chris Harvard. He was in fact a Harvard graduate whose own ring career was ended by a devastating boot to the chin.
And it ended up basically cleaning my clock, giving me a concussion. And it just progressively got worse to the point where I couldn't even hold a conversation.
Now, Nowinski suffered from violent nightmares that he often acted out.
I jumped off the bed and went into the wall and then fell through the nightstand and didn't even wake up for another 20 seconds, she said. And that's when I realized that I needed to stop until I figured out what was going on with my brain.
It wasn't until he visited his 8th doctor, a renowned neurosurgeon in Boston, that he learned he'd been suffering a series of undiagnosed concussions of the brain.
I even found out I didn't even know what a concussion was. You know, I called them dings and bell ringers when I would, you know, black out in the ring, or I would see, you know, the sky actually would go orange on me, the ceiling. And I just always thought those were normal things.
Nowinski's medical odyssey finally led him here, the University of West Virginia, where he met Dr. Julian Bales, who'd studied athletes with concussions, thousands of them, along with his colleague, Dr. Benoit.
What really surprised us was the amount of mental and cognitive problems that they were having, and also